Stories to Share. My name is Sean Driscoll. I'm a board member here at the Civic Center, and I'll act as moderator for tonight's talk. Stories to Share is a series of talks started by tonight's speaker, Joe Steinfield. The Civic Center is able to put this series on thanks to the individual supporters of the Civic Center and the corporate sponsors of this series. They are Bell Tates, the Monadnock Ledger Transcript, and the Savings Bank of Walpole. We're very thankful for what they do. I'm going to introduce Joe, and then he has the hour to talk. If he finishes early, we might have time for some questions. In any case, at the conclusion of the talk, there will be a reception in the conference room, graciously provided by Nancy Beltate and Jean Duval, and we hope you'll stay afterwards to ask Joe questions and to talk with the people that are here. We are ending the 5th season with the man who started it all. Our speaker, Joe Steinfield, has practiced law for 60 years, taught law at 3 different institutions, written 2 books, and penned over 300 articles for the Monadnock Ledger Transcript, the Keene Sentinel, and the Concord Monitor. But his biggest claim to fame is that he started this series. I'm 62 years old, and I often find myself saying that I wish people younger than me would just listen to my advice. Their lives would be so much better if they did. So when Joe asked me to take over Stories to Share, I agreed with the condition that he help me out. And I resolved to listen to him. It is one of the wisest decisions I've ever made. Throughout this year, he has saved me many times. He has caught mistakes, advised caution, provided clarity, and challenged me to do things differently than I would have done on my own. And all of his advice came with tremendous energy and really good humor, often in the form of stories similar to the ones that he has in his column. It's too bad that everyone who starts an endeavor can't have a trial lawyer with 60 years of experience and a good sense of humor to help them out. I am so lucky to have had the chance to listen to Joe. I think you are lucky to have the chance tonight to listen to Joe. Let's give a big, warm Civic Center welcome to Joe.
Thanks. During the first couple of decades of my career as a lawyer, I did a lot of family law cases, divorces, custody, will contests, and the like. And in those cases, frequently, it was important to have an expert witness, a psychiatrist. So I developed quite a bit of experience locating such witnesses, preparing them for trial, and so on. And I also learned that even if they weren't going to testify, it was important for me to use them as consultants so I could learn something about the subject at hand. Well, word got out to an organization called the Women in Psychiatry Committee of the Massachusetts Psychiatry Society. And I got a phone call. This woman introduced herself as the chairperson of the women's group and invited me to come to her house to speak on the subject of preparing to testify at trial. That is, if you're a psychiatrist. So of course I said, certainly, I'd be glad to. I went to her house in Newton, 25 or 30 psychiatrists, all women except one, as I recall, were in attendance. I gave my talk and told a few stories and then said, I'll be glad to entertain questions. So somebody asked a question, somebody else asked a question, and then one of the doctors stood up and said, Mr. Steinfield, could you tell me about the thus and such a case? I didn't know anything about the case. So I pretended not to hear the question. And I went on to something else. Well, she was not about to permit me to evade that question. So she said, excuse me, you're not answering my question. I want you to discuss the thus and such case. And I said, I had no choice at this point. I'm sorry. I'm not familiar with that case. And the chairwoman stood up, the host, and said, oh my God, I invited the wrong Steinfield. Now, Sean, I hope you got the right Steinfield. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to return in a somewhat different capacity than in previous years. I am thrilled with the fact that this series exists, and I see so many familiar faces, repeat offenders, and I'm sure next year will be even better. He ran out of speakers, as you can see, when he needed someone for today, and I am lucky to wind up the season. Well, here is the name of my talk, Gone Fishin', a trial lawyer's memories. And preparing this talk, what I discovered was I have quite a few memories. And I won't get to all of the stories or the slides, but I'll get to some of them. But I want to begin with my father. Born in Chelsea, Mass. in 1891, not educated, lived in Claremont, New Hampshire from a young age. And he and his two brothers, one older, one younger, started a factory. And he liked being a businessman, but what he really liked was being a fisherman. When I was young, 12, 13, something of that age, we were at the home in which I grew up in Claremont. Nice house. And my father said to me, you should be a lawyer when you grow up, because anytime you feel like it, you can just take off your jacket, hang it on the back of the door, leave the office, and go fishing. Well, Perry Mason was the first lawyer that I encountered, not a real lawyer, but he was on television. I'm looking at the room, and most of you are old enough to remember Perry Mason. I loved it. I thought that was being a lawyer. Discovering the real culprit, pulling a rabbit out of a hat, looked good to me. And I graduated from high school in Claremont just as Perry Mason was beginning on television. And I should have been in class, but instead I was watching Perry Mason. And I read a book. This book, published near the end of my college career, My Life in Court by Louis Nizer. And it also was very influential in my decision to become a trial lawyer But before I get to that, I should tell you about a seminal event that occurred when I was 16. My father was in poor health. He and his brother did not get along, older brother, and they agreed that one would buy the other's interest and they would have a negotiation and the other would no longer be part of the company. My father had very good lawyers, a firm in Concord that still exists called Orr and Reno. My uncle had a very well-known lawyer named Lewis Wyman, who went on to become a member of Congress and a senator. Along the way, my father decided to bring in an additional lawyer. And so he found a man in Boston named Benjamin Levin, who had started a firm then called Mintz, Levin, and Cohn, today an international firm with the same three names plus a couple of others. And Mr. Levin came from Boston to Manchester for one weekend. At the end of that weekend, a deal had been reached for the sale of the business, and Mr. Levin went back to Boston, and a few days later, his bill arrived in the mail. So, sitting in the dining room of the house you saw a minute ago, my father opened the mail, and here's Mr. Levin's bill, and he looks at the bill, and he says, "Here, take a look." So I look at the bill. Mr. Levin worked one weekend, did a very good job. The bill was for $10,000. Now, just to put this in perspective, that's $150,000 today. So my father said to me, "What do you think I should do?" Well, now you see, I overlooked something. My father had told me he was willing to buy out his brother, and when I grew up, I could have this company. I would own the company or run it, and I told my father, I was 16, sell it. Which is an important point here because I'd already more or less made a decision. At least, I didn't know what I was thinking. I didn't know any lawyers. There were none in my family. I'd never been in a courtroom. In fact, I don't think I was ever in a courtroom until I was standing up in a courtroom. I was relying on what I saw on television and this book that I'll get back to in a minute. Well, in the book, Mr. Nizer writes about his cases, one of which was called Quentin Reynolds versus Westbrook Pegler, a case that he tried in the 1950s. Quentin Reynolds was a well-known war correspondent. Westbrook Pegler was a well-known Hearst newspaper writer, and he had attacked Reynolds in print, accusing him of being morally corrupt, of being dishonest, of being a coward. So Reynolds and his wife went to see Mr. Nizer and hired him, and Mr. Nizer took the case. And as he relates in the book, the first thing he undertook was get the facts. Good lesson for a trial lawyer. So he went to England, and he started at the top, Lord Beaverbrook, Lord Mountbatten, and the head of the campaign in the Western Desert opposing the Axis troops led by General Rommel, known as the Desert Fox. And it turned out that those leaders of the war effort had nothing but praise for Quentin Reynolds and his heroism, his insistence on being on the front lines, contrary to what Mr. Pegler had written. And in 1955, I didn't know about it at the time, that's the very year in which I told my father, sell it, the jury awarded $175,000. Again, in today's dollars, that would be over $2 million. Well, my mother loved watching the Jack Parr show. I'm looking around, you remember that? Before Johnny Carson. And after that victory, Louis Nizer was a frequent guest on the Jack Parr show. And I'm in college at the time, we're in the late 50s, but yes, he was a good speaker, and when I was home, I would watch with my mother. Little did I imagine that our paths would cross face to face. We'll get to that. But, you know, somehow various things happened between watching Louis Nizer on television while I'm in college and coming face to face with him, beginning with getting through college, going to law school, and then getting a job for the summer after my first year. Well, here on the screen, you can see where I went to work, the Fuller Brush Company. I was a Fuller Brush salesman. You know, it's not that different from being a trial lawyer. You carry this heavy case, just like a trial lawyer, full of samples. And you develop a thick skin because you get no for an answer, another good quality for a trial lawyer. And taking no for an answer, actually, as I think about it, although in a different context, I'll let you use your imagination. That's not the first time I took no for an answer, but that we'll pass on that. And then I went back to law school, and I got a job between the second and third year at a firm, and you see it on the screen, with a 5-name title, Herrick, Smith, Donald, Farley, and Ketchum, an old and highly respected Boston firm, doesn't exist anymore. And I showed up for work, and the hiring partner took me to my office, and he said to me, well, I'm sorry, I don't have any work for you right now. By the way, this experience stayed in my head because decades later, I was the hiring partner at a law firm, and I always made sure there were assignments waiting on day one. Because what happened was this hiring partner said, have you taken trusts? Well, the answer was, no, I haven't. I want to be a trial lawyer, like Perry Mason. Well, he said, here, and he handed me the 1-volume abridgment, under 1,000 pages, of this treatise on the law of trusts. And he said, why don't you read this? So I sat down, and I figured, you know, they're paying me $100 a week. I started to read the book. Well, fortunately, within the next day or so, somebody gave me an assignment, and I went into the library and did research, that sort of thing. And then one day, somebody said, Mr. Ketchum would like to see you in his office. Well, Herrick, Smith, Donald, and Farley were long gone. Mr. Ketchum, here I am. I looked pretty young. I even have a picture of me coming up, but I felt like I'm starting at the top. This is pretty good. So I was in Mr. Ketchum's office with two of the younger lawyers in the firm, and it turned out we had been summoned to witness a will. And the will was of a man named Higginson. I think, but I'm not sure, that he was a direct descendant of the founder of the Boston Symphony, which happened to be a client of the firm's. But the picture you see of the National Shawmut Bank is at the center of this episode, of this little anecdote, because the client was the president of the bank. So we witnessed the will, we were about to leave, and Mr. Higginson said, "You know, I have a question, Phil," addressing Mr. Ketchum, "and I need some advice." So Mr. Ketchum looked at the three of us and said, "Wait a minute, let's hear the question." So Mr. Higginson said, "Well, we're having a problem in the banks. Bank robbers come in. They go up to the teller's window and they say, 'This is a stick-up, give me your money, give me the cash.' So what I want to do is give all of the tellers guns, and then when somebody comes up to rob them, they can take out the gun and shoot the robber. And my question is that okay?" So Mr. Ketchum said, "Well, we've got these three young men here," and he points to the most senior of the three, who says, "Well, Mr. Ketchum, John here has been in law school more recently than I have." John says, "Mr. Ketchum, have you met Joe Steinfield? He's in law school right now and took criminal law. Let's ask him." So this eminent lawyer says to me, "Well, young man, what do you say?" I paused. I was wondering, what's going on here? So finally, I looked at him and at his client, and I said, "Sure," in response to the question whether he can give guns. Sure. Not on the one hand or on the other hand, as lawyers want to do. "Well," he said, "thank you very much. I hadn't thought about this recently, but you know, they never offered me a permanent job at that law firm." Well, I told you I would show you this picture. It's hard to recognize that person from my law school yearbook. And then I had the first of a great many lucky breaks, which was becoming the law clerk to a member of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, Justice Reardon. And being a law clerk, as anyone will tell you who's done it, creates not only a close relationship, more often than not, but a great experience. And I certainly, in the court term 1964-1965, I was his only law clerk. Today, judges have 2, 3, 4 law clerks. But it was just him and me, and I went to the hearing on the first day of the term, and a case was argued involving Stop and Shop in Peabody. And the case involved an accident in which a police officer was injured. He was doing security work just inside the store on opening day. And the store had so-called bundle boys in the front of the store, and shoppers would go back to their car, drive up, the bundle boys would direct them, they would pick up their groceries and drive off. Well, one such driver, being directed by the bundle boys, crashed through the window on opening day and struck the police officer, who lost a leg. Well, he sued Stop and Shop. And I had read the papers and the briefs, and then went in with the other law clerks. We were brand new, and heard the argument. And the lawyer and I had thought to myself before going in, wait a minute, it's the driver's fault. And the lawyer got up and he looked at the 7 members of the court and he said, do you know what Stop and Shop did? They put a bunch of teenagers out there to direct traffic. They didn't train them, just a bunch of kids. And it was like a light goes off in your head. Wait a minute. Now I'm beginning to see the case a little differently. Went back to the desk after the argument. The judge called me in. He said, Joe, we drew the Laws case, meaning that he was responsible for writing the opinion, and he asked me to write the opinion, a draft. So I did. And I probably shouldn't say this, but I will. It only happened once in my clerkship year. The court's published opinion was my draft. Unbelievable. Not only did that not happen again, but in my years as an associate writing briefs and memoranda for senior partners at my law firm, it never happened. That one time. The lesson I learned as a trial lawyer was never waive oral argument. It makes a difference. So now I needed a job, and I got hired at a firm called Hill and Barlow, founded by a legendary Boston lawyer. The firm was founded in 1896. I won't speak about Mr. Hill at any length. He was not, we did not overlap, but I worked with many lawyers who had worked with him. But what I learned when I interviewed the firm was that Mr. Hill had represented Sacco and Vanzetti pro bono. And I learned that the firm believed in doing public interest work. And I liked that idea. Seemed to me, Herrick and Smith, very good firm, but a little different. And I was delighted, Herrick Smith wasn't hiring me anyway, to get this offer from the firm founded by Mr. Arthur Hill. And you see on the screen now his statement essentially saying, if a wealthy person hired me to take on a case for a $50,000 retainer, I, of course, would do it. Any lawyer would. And he went on to say, I do not see how I can decline a similar effort on behalf of Sacco and Vanzetti, simply because they are poor devils against whom the feeling of the community is strong, and they have no money with which to hire me. I won't particularly enjoy the proceedings, but I don't see how I can possibly refuse to make the effort. 1927. Professor Frankfurter had requested that he take the case. He already had an enormous reputation. In fact, he left the practice of law when Woodrow Wilson was president and spent 6 months lobbying for the confirmation of Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court, President Lowell of Harvard being one of his major opponents, there was anti-Semitism involved in the Brandeis nomination, not to mention that he was a controversial Boston lawyer. And beyond that, Mr. Hill had become the counsel to the city of Boston when there was a policeman's strike. He was an admirable, highly regarded Boston lawyer. So here are his clients, hiring partners at the firm, including myself in later years. Got a lot of mileage over the fact that this was the firm that took on this representation. I was caught up short one time because a lawyer said to me, yes, but you lost and they were executed. Well, that is true, but it was foundational to this law firm. So I walked in the office door in August of 1965, and there was a guy standing there. You're looking at him on the screen, and he turned around and he said, "Who's this?" And I told him, and he said, "I'm Mike Dukakis." Michael, at the time, was already quite well known. He was a member of the state legislature. He was the first person I met at the firm, and we have been friends from then until today. Michael is almost 93. His health isn't great, but he was part of the tradition of that law firm. I then met a lawyer named Calvin Bartlett, one of my two mentors. I'm sorry, here's Mr. Bartlett, but I meant to show you first a man named Gail Mahoney, who by that time, in his late 30s, had prosecuted a famous case called the Boston Undercommon Garage case, in which several public officials, judges, and others went to jail for corruption. Gail became one of my two mentors. Any trial lawyer who has time to reflect about his career realizes how much he learned by watching others, and I had this great privilege of working with Mr. Mahoney and Calvin Bartlett, who, by the way, was the grandson of a New Hampshire governor. For Gail Mahoney, every case was, in his words, a honey of a case. It didn't matter what it was. You could take the most boring case in the world. He made it a honey of a case. Well, Bartlett was instinctively a genius at cross-examination. And another thing you think about, if you're looking back on cases, is the importance of cross-examination. Interesting, the Bible says the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. Well, I'll get to that back to that in a minute, but I want to mention the day I arrived at Hill and Barlow, before I met Mr. Bartlett. And once again, history repeats itself. They welcomed me, but they didn't have an office for me, so they put me in someone else's office in the corner, a young lawyer, and I could borrow his phone or dictating machine if need be. Didn't matter to me, I didn't have any work. And then a young lawyer came and he said to me, introduced himself and asked me to follow him, which I did. We walked down 2 flights of stairs, and I got my first assignment to ink the Xerox machine and be sure it had paper. Now, when you think about it, you go through college and law school and a clerkship, and your first job is inking the Xerox machine. You know, if If you did that to somebody today, you'd be up on charges. Well, they're paying me more than $100 a week. I think my salary that year was $7,200 a year, so I'm not going to argue, and I went back to the office, and I had my second assignment. I was called up to the senior partner's office, and he said, there's a ladder in the basement. Would you go down, get the ladder, because it's fall, and I'd like you to switch over the grill for the colder weather. So I said, okay. And I did. That was my second job as a lawyer. And I was thinking back then, maybe I should have taken my father up on when I was 16. Well, the die was cast, and I got to work with Mr. Bartlett, Calvin Bartlett, who was 70-ish at the time. And it was a divorce case. We represented the wife. The husband was the number 2 person at the Peter Fuller Cadillac Old Company in Boston, and they put on the accountant for the company, basically having to do with the husband's worth and assets and expectancies and so forth. And he then faced Mr. Bartlett for cross-examination. Now, I cannot tell you exactly how this came about. I was sitting I was second chair, I was sitting at the counsel table. Counsel for the husband was one of the senior members of the Boston Bar, and he had his nephew, well-known Boston family, the McLaughlin brothers, sitting there, and Mr. Bartlett started to cross-examine, and I buried my head in my hands because it was obvious that this man did not remember which case he was trying. It was so sad and embarrassing, nothing I could do. And he mumbled and he shuffled papers and he scratched his head. I mean, I remember that Mr. McLaughlin Sr. never interrupted, and neither did the judge. I wanted to get up and just say, Mr. Bartlett, this is the Clifford case. Then all of a sudden, Mr. Bartlett, I noticed the witness was getting a little sweaty, a little red. And all of a sudden, Mr. Bartlett became practically Shakespearean. Now, Mr. Expert CPA, he spit out the words. Yes, Mr. Bartlett. You now know something you didn't know a few minutes ago. Isn't that true? Yes, Mr. Bartlett. And what you now know is that the Peter Fuller Cadillac Olds Corporation has not been keeping its accounting records in accordance with GAAP, the letters that stand for generally accepted accounting principles. Yes, Mr. Bartlett. And Mr. Expert CPA, by now, he's unbelievable. He's on this cross-examination roll. You're going to leave court today and go back to your office and call a meeting of your partners, aren't you? Well, by now, I mean, we can't believe what we're seeing. And the answer was, yes. And you're going to tell, well, you get the drift. Now, I don't know how he did it. He just had the gift, and it was a great experience. Well, I managed to have what I would call a Cal Bartlett moment in a case on Cape Cod that took 26 days of trial. It was a family law case, and in a way, I'm sorry I had this case so early in my career, early 70s, because I never had anything else quite like it. To shortcut the story, I represented this impoverished graduate student who had taken up with an heiress They lived in New York, and they had 2 children. And she picked up and left and went to Cape Cod, which is how we ended up in Barnstable County. And they had gone to Mexico and gone through a marriage ceremony. One of the issues was whether they were married or not. She said, I didn't know what was going on. I went there, but I didn't understand anything because it was all in Spanish, and I do not speak Spanish. So I got up and I said, now, madam, that's something I learned from Bartlett. Madam, you know. Now, madam, you say you don't speak Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. Are you sure? I'm sure. Well, I want you to take a look at this document. So she looks at the document, and I said, would you just say that first word at the top? So she says, certificado. I said, do you know what that means? I don't speak Spanish. Well, try. Certificate? Oh, by the way, her signature, was on the document, and she had, yes, that's my signature. Now let's try the second word. She says, matrimonio. What does that mean, do you think? I don't speak Spanish. Well, give it a try. Matrimony? You do speak Spanish. Well, I had an expert witness who was a young lawyer from Juarez, New Mexico. That's where this marriage ceremony took place. But there was a problem, which was that both my client and this heiress, the mother of the 2 children, knew that the marriage ceremony in Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, wasn't worth anything. And they knew that because Council of New York told them, you can go down there, but it isn't valid. And the reason was perfectly straightforward. She already had a husband. But if you want to paper it over, you can do it. And so they went through this. Well, the major effort by this woman was to have a ruling that the children were illegitimate. Now, this, you have to understand, this is in the early 70s. And the reason she wanted them to be declared illegitimate was that she wanted to cut them off 100% from my client, who, again, you got to think back to the early 70s, she claimed was a danger to the children on account of being, as she put it, a homosexual. So the case had a lot going on. Well, the law of Massachusetts said that children are legitimate if they are born to a man and woman who go through a marriage ceremony believing it to be legal. Well, of course, these people knew it wasn't legal. However, the law of New York said the children are legitimate if the parents go through a ceremony of marriage in accordance with the law of the place where the marriage occurs. So now I have to prove that this ceremony in Juarez was in accordance with the rules down there. And we had this expert witness who came up for that purpose and who testified carrying a copy of the Spanish Civil Code. And he took the judge through every step. And he was brilliant. And I thought by the end of the direct examination, mid-morning, we've got this cold. They did everything in Juarez according to the rules. That's going to make the children legitimate, irrespective of what the parents thought. So then the lawyer for the mother starts in on him, and he's got stuff I didn't know about. And it's looking terrible. It came time for lunch. We went to lunch, and I turned to this young lawyer who was my expert, and I said, "We're in trouble." He said, "Joe, don't worry about a thing. When we get back to court, just ask me to explain." So I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah." So we went back to court. I said, "Please explain." And he looked up at the judge and he said, "Your Honor, we have in Mexico, as you have in the United States, a federal system. We have state law and we have federal law. Marriages are controlled by state law. And what I told you before was state law." Everything that he asked me before lunch has to do with Mexican federal law. Hasn't got anything to do with this marriage. So the judge starts to smile. I then did something that every trial lawyer should know how to do. I shut my mouth. I asked no further questions. The judge asked the other lawyer, "You got any questions?" He said, "No, no further questions." I want to go back to Mr. Bartlett, because Mr. Bartlett in the late 60s took on a case known as the Spock case. Benjamin Spock, you know, we all raised our children turning the pages of Spock. He was indicted in Boston with 4 other people for encouraging draft resistance. And the case was in federal court, and Dr. Spock was represented by Leonard Boudin from New York. William Sloane Coffin, the chaplain at Yale, was represented by James D. St. Clair, famous Boston lawyer. 2 other defendants were represented by well-known Boston lawyers. And the 5th defendant, Marcus Raskin, was represented by Mr. Bartlett. Well, I was very interested in watching how is he going to handle this. So first he had to find an appropriate second chair to work with him on the case. And he found such a person, General Telford Taylor, who had succeeded Justice Jackson as chief counsel of the Nuremberg trials. That's pretty good. And they went up to court for some preliminaries. And the question was, well, where will the lawyers sit? So Boudin and St. Clair and the others, they wanted to be well positioned, set up tables near the jury, etc. So I'm watching Mr. Bartlett. He's not saying anything. And he ultimately takes a table and chairs so far away from the judge he could barely see the judge or the jury, and that's where they took up shop for the trial. He was some strategist. This was a conspiracy case, and basically the symbolism was, we don't have anything to do with these people. We don't even know them. And he objected very few times, and he kind of just took a place away from the trial and let everybody else battle it out. But occasionally asking cogent questions. Well, the jury convicted 4 defendants, acquitted 1, Marcus Raskin, who we learned later was upset about what had happened because he felt as if he had abandoned his colleagues. Well, I have never met his son, Congressman Jamie Raskin, but I would like to do so and ask him about the case. So I tried other cases carrying Mr. Bartlett's bag, Mr. Mahoney's bag, and I learned a great deal. Then I got involved in a case here in New Hampshire. I knew the person whom you see on the screen, Pete Burling. He had worked at Hill and Barlow, my firm, and then had moved up to Cornish, New Hampshire, where he still lives. And in fact, his wife became the first female judge in the state of New Hampshire. The second, by the way, Martha Crocker is here. Judge Crocker. And in the spring of 2000, there was a huge controversy surrounding a member of the New Hampshire Supreme Court named Steve Thayer. Steve Thayer was going through a divorce, and he already had a somewhat checkered reputation. Pete called me and said, "Are you following what's going on up here?" Meaning in New Hampshire. Matter of fact, the pianist and I were at our house just up the road here in Jaffrey on this Saturday morning when Pete called me. It seemed that there was a meeting of the judges to decide on who would be on basically a pickup court to hear the appeal in the Thayer divorce, and that the members of the court were all disqualified. It was one of their own who was a party to this divorce, but nonetheless there was a discussion about who should serve on the court, and that Thayer himself was part of the discussion and objected to one of the potential judges, and that Chief Justice Brock had gone to the clerk, and that the clerk had written a memorandum and sent it to the Attorney General, who then conducted an investigation of Justice Thayer. So what Pete Burling was calling me about was that the legislature had directed the Judiciary Committee of the New Hampshire legislature to undertake a full investigation of the Chief Justice and anyone else on the court who might be implicated, and they needed a lawyer. "What are you doing on Monday?" Pete said to me. I said, "Nothing special." He said, "I want you to come up to Concord," which I did. And I went to the State House, and I met with the Speaker of the House, Donna Sitek, and about 15 other people. They needed a lawyer who was going to represent the Judiciary Committee and to conduct an investigation, and I got the case. Now that was a honey of a case. The next day, Speaker Sitek called and said, "We'd like you to do it." And I said, "Well, that's very flattering. Give me a day to think about it." I immediately went to Gail Mahoney. By that time, I was a partner in the firm, but I always went to Mr. Mahoney to see what he had to say. And then I made a phone call to the retired Chief Justice of Massachusetts, whom I knew quite well. And Justice Hennessy said, "Joe, you should do it, but remember, this is not the ordinary case. You will have in your hands the fate of the New Hampshire Supreme Court." Well, that may have been a bit of an overstatement, but he underscored this is serious stuff. I took the job, and the gentleman you see here, former employee of the Conservation Commission of the state, was the chair, Henry Mock, and met with him and the Judiciary Committee. I had my own office in the State House. I even had a parking space in the basement with my name on it. It was on a piece of cardboard, I will admit, but still. And a secure fax machine. Shows you how times have changed. So the Constitution of New Hampshire, and you see highlighted in front of you, had slightly different grounds to impeach. Bribery, not high crimes and misdemeanors, but bribery. Well, there was no bribery issue. Corruption, well, that didn't seem to fit what we understood. Malpractice or maladministration. Well, God knows what those words mean. However, after televised public hearings, the full House in the summer of the year 2000 impeached Chief Justice David Brock on 4 counts, all involving ethical issues. One of them, the first one, had to do with a case and a claim that the Chief Justice had called Judge Gray. Judge Gray had presided over the Pamela Smart case, well-known judge, to tell Judge Gray that the case before him had as one of its parties Senator DuPont, who was the head of the Senate Finance Committee that controlled the budget of the court, and that he made this phone call, never told anybody. So that was considered to be either malfeasance or malpractice. Then there was a second one having to do with this conversation with Justice Thayer about who would be the judge or judges to sit in the Thayer appeal. That didn't seem right. The third count was that in his deposition, I took his deposition for 3 days, Chief Justice Brock, he had testified falsely. And the fourth one, very interesting, was the one that caught the most attention when we went to trial in the fall of 2000 before the New Hampshire State Senate. And that one was that after hearings, Chief Justice Brock, like his predecessor, allowed disqualified members of the court to sit in on the discussions. That didn't seem right either. Well, I cannot go into all of the details, but there is available somewhere online the report that I submitted that goes into all of the details, factual details, that we accumulated during the investigation. Now, that investigation was televised on New Hampshire Public Television, and a former State Attorney General named Tom Rath had done the sort of the color, the play-by-play on television, and he was a very close friend of David Souter. Now, Justice Souter had been a member of the New Hampshire Supreme Court in the 80s before going on the United States Supreme Court. In fact, members of the Judiciary Committee wanted me to call David Souter to testify at the hearings. And one of the reps on the committee was adamant, and the committee decided not to call Justice Souter as a witness for me to take his deposition, a position that I actually encouraged them to take. Well, we end up in the state Supreme Court after the impeachment. Here you see the president, I don't mean state Supreme Court, the state Senate. Here you see the president of the Senate. She hired a very good lawyer. Senator Mitchell, who had been the majority leader. He then helped settle the Northern Ireland crisis. And they came up to Concord, and he met with me and with the lawyer for the Chief Justice. You see him here. Mike Madigan, he was a partner in a big Washington firm, and they brought a bunch of lawyers to New Hampshire. Interestingly, Mike Madigan, we went toe-to-toe, 3 weeks of trial in the state Senate. Here you see an excerpt from his obituary. He died last year. This is, so far as I know, the only obituary ever written that features a case that I lost. Well, here you see the Chief Justice and his wife at the trial. He was acquitted on all 4 counts, and we knew he would be. And the reason we knew was that the Constitution says nothing about whether it's a 2/3 vote to convict or a majority. Senator Mitchell sat with Madigan and me and said it's going to be a 2/3. Well, unlike judges, state senators are free to speak in public, and before we ever started the trial, at least 1/3 of them had made it clear they were going to vote for the chief no matter what. Well, in a way, it relieved me of a certain amount of pressure because I knew I was going to lose. But it was a wonderful opportunity. I've said this in other forums. This state had a boil that needed to be lanced, and that was the relationship between the legislature and the state Supreme Court. And this proceeding enabled that to happen. So the case ends, and it was also televised. I went down to Puerto Rico to the judicial conference a few months later, and I see David Souter, whom I overlapped in law school but didn't really know. I walked over to introduce myself, and Justice Souter said, "Joe, I know who you are. I owe you a debt of gratitude." I said, "No, you don't." I said, if I had thought your testimony was important having to do with this phone call, I'm running out of time, but I should tell you that the court did an investigation in the 80s that we found out about as to whether or not the Chief Justice had called Judge Gray during the home gas trial. And Justice Souter, then a member of the New Hampshire court, led that investigation, wrote the report. Nobody ever knew. It was the case without a number, without a file, but the court voted 4-1 that he made the phone call. Who do you think the one was? Chief Justice Brock. However, the court then said, but he did not do it to try to influence Judge Gray. Well, I was having this conversation with David Souter, and he said to me, "I want you to know what I did." I was following the case closely. Tom Rath was keeping me posted, and I called the clerk. That's the clerk who wrote that memorandum that got the whole thing going, because he said, I didn't have a clear memory of the case. And I asked him to send me all of the files from Concord about the home gas case, and he did, because I had decided that if I had anything useful to offer you in this case, I was going to call you up, volunteer to come to Concord, and testify. And I reviewed the files, and there was nothing I had to offer. And it's one of the most extraordinary conversations. Here I am talking to a member of the United States Supreme Court who tells me that he was going to do something which would have to have been the most honorable thing I can think of. I was going to volunteer. He is one of my heroes. Well, 2 years later, I lost another case. This is a case involving whether Mitt Romney was or was not eligible to run for governor. Did he satisfy the residency requirements? And I lost the case before a state commission in Massachusetts. And not too long afterwards, I was interviewed in California to represent Fox Television in a case. So they said to me, well, can you tell us about your cases? So I said, well, I told them about the impeachment case. How did it come out? I lost. Well, can you tell us about another case? So I told them about the Romney case. Here you see me examining Mitt Romney. How'd it come out? I lost. So the lawyer for Fox, the in-house, looks at me and says, "You're the only lawyer we've ever interviewed who brags about the cases he lost. Have you ever won a case?" Interestingly, they did hire me. I'm now going to jump ahead. It's after 6. I was going to play this short excerpt from my cousin Vinny. If you want to see how to cross-examine, go online and watch my cousin Vinny. Samuel Eliot Morison, can I have 5 more minutes?
Sure.
Was the historian of the U.S. Navy. His daughter was the editor of Bartlett's Book of Quotations, and she was married to a partner with whom I worked a great deal at Hill and Barlow. And his father-in-law, Admiral Morison, had become a professor at Harvard after World War II, and he sent his son-in-law, his name was Brooks Beck, some pretty good clients, including John Kenneth Galbraith, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., oh yes, Julia Child. And I got to represent her. In cases where people imitating her would attempt to sell their products as if she was endorsing them, we never went to trial because those cases were easy to settle because she never endorsed a product. And so we would settle for some appropriate amount, and I would give her the money, and she would donate it to her favorite charity, the American Institute for Food and Wine. And then she would say to me, "Oh, Joe, I do hope they do it again. The Institute needs the money, you know." I've had a number of wonderful precedent-setting cases. In this particular case, a liquor store sold beer to an underage driver who struck and killed a Russian immigrant who was a professor at Brandeis. It was the first time that a package store was held liable in those circumstances. You know, it was one thing for Officer Luz to win his case because of the Bundle Boys. This is a case where a teenager buys beer illegally, goes home, drinks the beer, borrows his mother's car, strikes and kills David Zilberman, who knew 15 languages. Ozzy Osbourne, many of you know, because it was in the press some months ago, that I got a call one day from a lawyer named Harley Lewin. "I got your name. I hear you're the best lawyer in Boston." Somehow that made it into this week's ledger. It's embarrassing because I think Lewin was the only person who thought that. But I wasn't going to disagree. I'm with Ozzy Osbourne and the band in Hershey, Pennsylvania. I said, "Who?" "We got a problem in Boston. We're playing up there Saturday, and they've revoked the license. I want you to fix it." I said, "Well, tell me more." So I ended up before the licensing board, and we got the license reinstated, subject to several conditions. So I called Lewin, and I said, "Here's the story. Tell the band. Here are the conditions. No obscenity. No nudity. No pyrotechnics. No violence. No feigned violence." I said, "Now be sure to tell him." So he said, "You worry too much." I said, "Just tell him." So he says, "Look, they're on their way up to Boston. They're staying at the Meridian Hotel. Why don't you go over there, and they'll pay you your fee. So I call the Meridian Hotel, and I say, may I please speak with Mr. Osborne? So they said to me, we don't have any guest of that name. So it's the day of the concert. I call the Boston Garden backstage, and the phone rings 25 times. No answering machine. Somebody answers the phone. Hello, I'd like to speak with Ozzy Osbourne. Oh, they're not here. They've gone out to dinner. Well, may I leave a message? Sure. Now, you won't believe this. Many of you may have seen the reality TV involving him and his wife, Sharon. I got a return call. This is Sharon. I'm the manager. I know who you are. Thanks for your help. Would you like to come to the concert? So, I'm wearing a suit. It's a rock concert. She said, come on over. Come backstage. We'd like to meet you. So I said, okay. I walk over to the Boston Garden. Now, picture this. Boston lawyer, carrying a briefcase, walking into the Boston Garden to an Ozzy Osbourne concert. And as I'm walking in, I hope I'm permitted to say this, some young guy is walking and looks over to me and he says, asshole. I made my way backstage and I meet Sharon. She says, would you like to meet Ozzy? I said, I'd love it. I'd never even heard of him a week earlier. I go over and he's painting his face. He knows about the case. He says, the whole story was wrong about me biting the head off of a chicken, yeah. He said, I'll tell you what happened. I worked in a slaughterhouse in England when I was a teenager, and I know about animals. I was performing in, I think it was Chicago. Somebody threw something up on the stage, and I thought it was a stuffed animal. I picked it up and I bit it. Turned out it was a dead bat. And I had to have rabies shots. And that's the whole story. I got it, as we say, from the horse's mouth. So then he said, would you like to meet the band? I said, yes. So I walk over and here's the band. So I said, all right, everybody, listen up. I'm your lawyer. Oh, yeah, we heard something about this. I said, do you know about the conditions? So the spokesperson for the band, the lead guitar player, said, what conditions? I thought, thanks, Harley Lewin. I said, well, you're in Boston. Yes, and here are the conditions. So I began, I listed them. No obscenity, no problem. No nudity, no problem. No pyrotechnics, no problem. No violence, no problem. No feigned violence. No feigned violence. Oh shit, now we can't hang the midget. Yes, there was a dwarf as a member of the band, and he piped up, it's okay, you can hang me twice tomorrow night in Hartford. Okay, last quick story. I got to litigate a case involving Pearl Harbor Day. And it came out of a book. You see it on the screen. And the battleship Oklahoma was torpedoed and capsized, and it was upside down. And men were trapped in the turret at the, I called it the rear of the ship, but I guess it's known as the aft. Or is it the bow? I get them confused. Anyway, they were rescued, and one of them was a man named Steve Young. Steve Young was reassigned after the men were rescued. A lot of people in the Oklahoma were killed. But these guys were rescued from an upside-down ship, and Steve Young was assigned to another ship, and who do you think was on that ship? Samuel Eliot Morison. It's funny how these people keep turning up. Well, after the war, Steve Young went to Harvard, and he's walking by the Widener Library, and he looks up, and there's Professor Morison, who recognizes him, and he says, "Did you write that book?" And so he wrote the book. The book described what happened after the torpedoing, specifically that as the ship was capsizing, the ensign in charge left the ship. Now, the senior ensign, and you won't believe this, Ensign Rommel, remember him from Niger and the campaign in northern Africa, he was on the mainland, and so Ensign Spittler was in charge. He told everybody, stay where you are, down in the lower handling room, and then he left. So this was in the book, essentially saying that Spittler had behaved in a cowardly way. Spittler sued, and I got hired to defend the Naval Institute Press and Bantam paperback. So I wanted to know, what was it like? Now, this is going to be my last story. To think you get paid to do this. The battleship Texas in Galveston Harbor is the sister ship of the Oklahoma, which, while being towed back to California when they uprighted it, sank. So I wanted to go see, what was it like? Well, representing the Naval Institute Press, I also had an inside, and we went to Texas, and we went into the turret, and we went to the shell deck, and we went down the hole from the shell deck to the lower handling room. Nobody had been in this part of the battleship Texas since the end of the war, filled with asbestos and rust. And here we are in the lower handling room, lawyers, the guy in the yellow shirt you may recognize, the author, and that was the site visit, and we got the best expert ever, Admiral Mack, who wrote the book, The Naval Officer's Guide, and the case came out, let me say, satisfactorily. Well, I was going to talk about a murder case. I don't have time. I will say, however, that the jury in this case decided that the phone company, which had basically hung up on an emergency caller, was not responsible for her death from 17 stab wounds, even though they hung up and didn't send anyone to help. And the clipping you're looking at includes the following. The dead woman's sister, we're disappointed. The juries have been manipulated by legal manipulations. Well, during the trial, which was televised, the NBC outlet, after each day, would interview the mother of the deceased young woman. And one day she said, the telephone company thinks they can get away with this by hiring an expensive lawyer. So the reporter came over to me and said, Mrs. Tobin says, and so forth, what do you say about that? And I said, I'm not expensive. Well, here is the picture that my sons claim is the best picture ever taken. On the left, Aroldis Chapman, then with Cincinnati, now the closer for the Red Sox. On the right, Big Papi. I always wanted my own Major League Baseball player as a client, and I got one. Well, here we are back at the end. We saw Michael when I met him, when I walked in the door, Here he is not too many years ago in the backyard of his home. He's not in as great shape today as he was then. And here, my partner, Reginald Lindsay. Now, I thought quite a bit about how I would end this talk. And it happens that today is not only May Day, but it's also Law Day. In the fall of 1969, a lawyer that I knew, went on to become a judge, called me on the phone. I'm an associate at the firm. He'd met a guy at the Harvard Law School. My firm should hire him, call him up. So Reg Lindsay graduated the following year, joined Hill and Barlow. He grew up in segregated Alabama. He went to Morehouse College. He went on to the Harvard Law School, where for the first time he had classmates who were white. He spent several years at my law firm. He was an extraordinary human being. He was erudite. He was very funny. He was wise. He was a great pleasure to be with. Well, he had health issues. He deteriorated. He ended up in a wheelchair. This official portrait of him is after he is sworn in as a judge in a wheelchair. He used to give talks and say, well, I'm very well qualified for this because they say a judge is sitting. And that's what I am doing. If you look at the historic lawyers, really remarkable people, you're hearing memories of a trial lawyer, Cal Bartlett, Gail Mahoney, Mike Dukakis, not to mention some others who passed through who were my law partners, Bill Weld, Deval Patrick, even Bob Mueller for a couple of years. And among those giants, Reg Lindsay. He was sworn in Faneuil Hall, I was there, and he quoted the president of Morehouse, Dr. Mays. The tragedy in life does not lie in not reaching your goals, but in not having goals to reach. And he talked about his dream and the dream of America and promised to be the good and faithful judge. He was my greatest contribution to the law firm. And we were together in good times and in bad, right up literally to his last breath. So as I said, today is Law Day. Law Day is part of the United States Federal Code, which declares that this is a day to appreciate the ideals of equality and justice under law. Not so easy in light of current events, but not a bad thing to remember, and they were Reg Lindsay's ideals. My great honor was to be his colleague and his friend, and I have given this talk in his memory.
We have gone over, so if people feel like they want to exit, I think we just have a couple more things to talk about, and I think we'll hold questions to the reception. That was really wonderful, Joe. It was really amazing. I have one thing to talk about, and then David's going to say a couple words, but feel free if you have to go. someone who wanted to remain anonymous has made a generous donation to the Civic Center. We have been given a number of signed copies of Joe's book, Time for Everything, that we can use for fundraising. And so copies are going to be on a table in the hallway, and you're welcome to take one in exchange for a contribution to the Civic Center. If you plan to give a large contribution in the future, then feel free to help yourself to one of the books. If you prefer to contribute cash or a check tonight, we would thank you in advance. And now I'll turn it over to David.
Joe, as you know, we are a very high-priced organization here. I'd like to present you a gift for your speaking here tonight, and I'd also have a few words that I'd beg your attention for a moment, audience. On behalf of the board, we are sincerely grateful to you, Joe, for your many contributions to the Jaffrey Civic Center. In particular, we want to recognize your intrepid leadership in creating and guiding our speaker program, Stories to Share. As its inventor, producer, and moderator, you brought this series to life during the challenges of the pandemic and helped it turn into a success the success it is today. Quite simply, it would not have happened without you. Many of us have also had the pleasure of learning from you firsthand. Your wit, your eloquence, and natural sense of timing set the standard that is both inspiring and, for some of us, a bit humbling. Speaking for myself, I'm still a work in progress, but I've certainly learned a great deal by watching you in action. Please know that you will always have a place here. You are forever part of this team, and you are welcome to step back in the role of moderator whenever you wish. Thank you, Joe, for your vision, your leadership, and your generosity in sharing your talents with all of us.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the Story to Share's staff, Nancy, my wife, who's a Michelin star chef, Jean Duval, who keeps me in line and does so much, spends much time here working. Megan, videographer, you're destined for television, I know it. Karen and Laura, who keep the ball bearings greased and the wheels oiled here, and do so much. Sean, you are just a little bit below Joe, but you're getting there. Join us for a small reception afterwards, and please know we have upstairs the spring show, and the auditorium here we have Peter Sandback's work, and in the display cases we have the ceramic work of Alexander Pope. Thank you all so much for coming. See you next year.